Greetings, race community. Brent coming in live from Savannah, Georgia, as my family and I continue our march northward, targeting a return to New England in early May. I am very excited to welcome Julie Hooper, who is the Vice Chancellor for University Development and Alumni Relations at the University of California, Berkeley, where she manages a team of over 250, a budget of over $60 million. We are so excited to get your perspective. Julie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brent. Thrilled to be here.
Well, one of our favorite ways to kick off the show has been not just going back through your resume, but actually starting at a very specific point, which is the Julie who was a junior or senior in high school trying to make her own college decision. Who were you? Where were you at the time? And ultimately, what led you to Boston University?
Well, it's a great question. I was very active with the speech and debate team in high school, especially senior high school, 11th and 12th grade. And I also was pretty sure I would go to college in Texas because my dad said you can go to UT, A&M, Rice, wherever, but you're staying in Texas. So my senior year, I was really lucky to get to go with my speech and debate team to the Harvard tournament. And my first trip to the Boston, Cambridge area, it was amazing. And I loved it. I fell in love with Boston and Cambridge, and it was really cold and snowy, but that's not the experience that I had growing up in Dallas. And BU had really been actively reaching out to me. John Silber was president of BU then. He'd been a dean at UT Austin back in the day and had gone to BU. And I think BU was actually really actively reaching out to get students from the South and the Southwest. And I was just getting a lot of attention from them. And I was sure I was going to UT. And in fact, I'd even sent in my deposit to live at Dobie, which is one of the dormitories at UT. And I was made an offer by BU, some scholarship money that made it possible for me to convince my dad to let me go to Boston. And, he'd never been there. He did not visit the campus. He put me on a plane in Dallas. I was raised by my dad. I'm an only child. We were very close. I can't, I think about that now. And when he passed away in 2017, I thought a lot about what that must have been like for him to put his only child on a plane in Dallas and send her to Boston. But It was the best experience for me. I loved Boston. And it's funny because I didn't apply to any other schools outside of Texas.
So you come back from this debate experience at Harvard and you're like, Dad, it was a good trip. And by the way, I might want to go to college in New England. I mean, was he, how happy was he you went on that trip in hindsight, I guess?
Probably not that happy, but ultimately very proud of me. And we actually had a lot of fun when he would come up to Boston. We went to Maine, we went out to Western Massachusetts. He was kind of a crazy driver himself. So he loved people driving in Boston and the double parking. And he was totally into it. I think he was ultimately very happy, and he really admired John Silber. I think somehow the fact that Silber was a Texan and from San Antonio and was president of BU comforted my father in some odd way. But yeah, I'm sure it was at the time pretty radical.
And so it's one thing to kind of have this experience, do the weekend, get enamored with the area, get excited about BU as an institution. It's another thing to actually live in the cold a good chunk of the year and actually be in a New England, culture versus a Texas culture a good chunk of the year. And so when you think about your maybe preconceptions or what you were excited about going to BU, was that realized? Like, what were some of the highlights? Any of the challenges? Was there a culture shock? I mean, what was your overall experience?
Yeah, no, all of those things. Acclimating to the weather was not easy. And now if I go someplace really, really cold or someplace really, really hot, which let's face it, I'm from Texas, I should be used to this. But because I live in Northern California, I'm a real wimp now. I don't like to be too hot or too cold. But you know, when I was 18, it was kind of fun, but I did have to learn how to wear layers and how to walk in the snow. BU is infamous for never canceling class, no matter how bad the snow was or how bad the weather was. So you have to learn to live in that environment. Culturally, it was definitely very different from Texas, and that was exciting to me. I was born in Houston, but raised in Dallas, and I have a lot of family in Houston. And of course, I will talk about Austin. I'm sure I lived there almost 20 years, but you know, Boston was very formative for me. When people say, "Oh, you don't sound like you're from Texas," I just laugh and say, "Well, that's 4 years in Boston." One of the other things that stood out to me when I first got to BU was I remember seeing the football field and thinking, oh my goodness, it's like a quarter of the size of my high school football stadium, right? But on the other hand, we had the bean pot and hockey, which was not something that we had in Dallas. Now there's the Dallas Stars, of course, but when in the 80s, no, there was no hockey. And so that was fun to experience, as was Head of the Charles, right? And I lived in a dormitory my freshman year. I was very lucky. I got to live in Shelton Hall, and we were on, I guess, the 8th or the 9th floor, and our suite looked out over the Charles, and we could sit up there and watch the Head of the Charles. How cool is that to get to do when you're an 18-year-old from Dallas? And so for me, I think the seasons too, I just grew to really love the seasons. And it's so funny, you know, being again from Texas, seeing how slightly warmer it would get from cold and people would put on shorts.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's actually short season right now in Boston because I think it was like 60 this week. So
yeah, exactly.
People are feeling good. Well, look, I mean, I can empathize a lot, and I think like some of those experiences like Bean Pot and Head of the Charles, if you're listening and you have no idea what those things are, Google them. Head of the Charles is this global rowing regatta. It's just, you can't describe it until you experience it if you haven't grown up around rowing. And certainly the Bean Pot, which is essentially the city championship among the top hockey teams in Boston, is, I mean, that's like homecoming for BU. I mean, that's sort of like homecoming for Northeastern. It's just an amazing event. And so how about, you know, academically, you mentioned that scholarship was an important part of your journey. You know, tell me more about that. I mean, for many of us, that's our first exposure to the world of philanthropy is, of course, you know, your own kind of experience as a beneficiary. So how I guess, important was that in not just the access to BU, but did you feel connected to that scholarship and philanthropy during your time as a student, or did it come later?
I think it came later. I will say though, I was also an RA, and I was an RA in Warren Towers. And if people know Warren Towers, it used to be the largest dorm in the country. And at one point, I think Texas had the largest dorm, but you know, we're all competing for that. But it's an enormous dormitory on Comm Ave. And I was in the B tower on the 13th floor. And I think being an RA in many ways, which I also did to help fund, you know, being in school because it covered my room and board, I feel like that was also a fantastic experience to connect me to the university. In a way, I'm not sure, you know, the scholarship made it possible to accept, but it was my dad who was looking at those bills. And it's funny because when he passed away, he kept everything. And I was going through, you know, his files, and I saw where he, you know, had written the checks, but I can see the scholarship line on the bill. And I'm thinking, wow, what a big deal that was. And I'm not the one writing the checks then, so I'm not realizing it in the same way. But being an RA was really important to me, and it really bonded me to BU in many ways. I think that my department, I was in the history department, and of course I was surrounded by history. You talk about, you know, culturally, how is it different? It's so much older. The buildings, the history, you're surrounded by history in Boston, right? And that, I loved that. And I think the campus, even though it's a very urban campus, you have places like Bay State Road, and you have, you know, Fenway Park is right there in Kenmore Square. And it's very alive. And I loved that. I loved the urban environment, even though it doesn't seem like a traditional campus. I also was active with an interview program, which I got to interview incoming applicants. We were trained to interview students who were applying to BU, and it was fun. That also connected me to the institution. So yes, the scholarship made it possible to make the choice to go there. I certainly now, knowing everything I know in higher ed philanthropy, boy, am I grateful for that. I would say when I was in graduate school, financial aid and scholarship funding I received in graduate school, I was much more directly aware of who the funders were who made things possible for me, more so than I was when I was 18.
Yeah. No, I think it's one of those, I feel the same way. Like I remember getting my financial aid letter to Brown. I remember seeing the name of the fund, but not really knowing what that meant. And you do wonder, and obviously there's been significant investment and programming to try to better connect, more, scholars with their donors, but it how do you make it more than a line item to a 19-year-old? And I think that's, still an area of opportunity to make it more real and instill some of that, culture during the student experience, for sure. But as you went through the history program, that can lead to a lot of paths, including senior leadership of a global fundraising organization like you are today. But you don't usually know that when you're sitting in history class. What were some of the paths that you were considering, and then ultimately, what was your stop beyond graduation? Your first stop?
Yeah, like you, I think I heard in one of your podcasts, maybe the one with Howard Heavner from my team at Berkeley. I had an international relations interest at one point. That was my first major, and then I switched to history. I took 2 semesters of Russian. I didn't do so well in that. I should have.
Do you have anything French. You want to dust off? Do you want to dust off any Russian for the podcast listeners right now?
I can say Меня zовут Yulia.
Меня zовут Brent. So actually, I'm right there with you. Wonderful. Wonderful. Yep.
But I because of my speech and debate background in high school, and it was such a big part of my life, if you'd asked me when I was 19, what would I do? I would have said I was going to go to law school. That's not ultimately what I did, but I think at that time, that was something that I felt was a very clear path for me. But I always had an interest in the international focus. When I graduated, though, in '92, it was not a good economy in Boston in the Northeast for hiring and jobs, and things were better in Texas. And I had to move back to Dallas. And I hate to say this, but my dad knew this. I mean, I remember being on that American Airlines flight from Boston back to Dallas, and I was in tears. I did not want to leave.
Wow.
But I came back to Dallas, and I moved home, as so many students have to do at a certain point. And I waited tables, for the summer while I job searched. And I got really lucky. I was hired in as a very entry-level person for a textile company, of all things, called Crow Resources International, that was doing work in India and China. Husband and wife owned company, small company. They also had a quilt company called Impressions Imports. And that was my first job out of college. And I started at the bottom and just did anything I was asked to do, basically. But eventually worked my way up to product management, and I got to spend a lot of time in India in my early 20s and work in business. It's incredible, really incredible.
All right. So favorite memory or craziest experience as young 20s in India doing global business at a time where that was still relatively early to be doing that sort of work, and your friends and classmates must have been wondering what is this job? I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, no, I had some friends come from BU who were living in Nashville, and Austin actually came up to see me in Dallas, and they just were sort of amazed by what I was getting to do. Me too, right? Sometimes I would be asked to go to India on like 48 hours notice because I was the person in the office that wasn't married, didn't have kids, didn't even have any pets. And at that point was living, in my own apartment in Dallas. So I'd say, sure, you want me to go to India in 2 days? Okay, I'll go.
Wow.
An interesting memory, and I wrote about this when I applied for graduate school, was going to southern India to one of our vendors in very, very rural southern India. a Muslim part of the nation. You know, India is a very complex democracy with a lot of religions and also different languages spoken. We were in southern India, and my boss, Ed Crow from Chicago, he and I were traveling together, and we were working with this vendor, and they refused to deal with me because I was a woman. And Ed finally said, and by the way, I couldn't go to the restaurant in this town because women weren't allowed inside. And he insisted that they bring food to this hotel. It was a pretty basic
And
hotel.
did you have that context when you were heading down to this meeting, or were you blindsided by it?
I was a little blindsided, to be honest with you. And I got laryngitis on this trip, on this part of the trip. So little irony there. But Ed said to them at one point, we were at the vendor's office and they just would not deal with me. And Ed finally looked at them and he said, "Do you realize she signs the purchase orders? If you want to get purchase orders, you have to deal with her." And they just sort of went, "Oh, all right. And I really think back on that. And that was probably 1993. 94 maybe, and Ed's, the way he stood up for me and made it just very clear, she's part of this and you have to work with her. I look back on that, and I have all kinds of crazy stories about traveling in India and things I learned and saw that amazed me. It's an amazing place. Talk about history, talk about spirituality. But I also saw some extremes of poverty that blew my mind, right? Wow. And I also saw the beginnings of the tech industry in Bangalore and what was happening there. And it's fascinating to me. And I also met a lot of women who were starting businesses in India, who were going down the entrepreneurial path and creating kind of a middle class and an entrepreneurial class, and a lot of women in the textile industry. And it was really exciting to see that. So I'm forever grateful for that early experience in my life.
And it had to be, just my understanding is you were in that role for a few years right out of college. Right. What an amazing experience. And, you know, in a certain regard, almost hard to imagine that didn't lead to some kind of global cross-border trade, career path, right? I mean, just given how early you were, what was the catalyst to go and pursue graduate school and sort of double down on the history and academic route?
Well, I it's funny when you look back on how things happen. I just got really tired of living in Dallas, and I was spending every weekend in Austin with my friends. I loved Austin. And I had a boyfriend in Dallas, and we broke up. And I sort of was at a point where I just didn't want to live in Dallas anymore. And I couldn't work for Ed and Doris and not be in the Crows and be in Dallas. Mm-hmm. And I gave them notice and I said, I'm going to move. And I told my dad, and he said, "Wait, you're quitting your good job and you're giving up your apartment and you're moving to Austin and you don't know what you're going to do?" That's what I did. And I had saved money, and I slept on a friend's couch in Austin as I was figuring out where was I going to live, what was I going to do next. And it's just ironic that, again, I fell back on, well, I know how to wait tables. I can work in a restaurant. I can, support myself while I go through a transition and figure out what I want to do. And that's how I met my husband. We've been together 25 years now.
Wow.
Isn't that funny? But we met literally within the first few months of my moving to Austin. And so in many ways, I feel like in my personal life, it was sort of fated, but I knew I wanted to go to graduate school. And I spent that time really thinking hard about what was it that I wanted to study. And it just was becoming more clear to me that law school was not my interest. And I can't even remember how I discovered the field of historic preservation, to be honest with you, but I looked at a number of programs in Chicago and Georgia and Texas and on the East Coast. And I think in my mind, my thinking about preservation, historic preservation, was getting that master's degree would be a way to meld my interest in history and the built environment and also find a job in the field. So visiting Athens, Georgia, one of the programs I was looking at, I met with the professor who ran the program at the time, John Waters, who ended up being my thesis advisor. It was really good to me. And I really liked him, and I loved Athens, and I love REM. And I thought, well, this would be cool to live here for a couple of years. So Rob went with me the first year, and then he went back to Austin. If you see the drum set behind me, my husband is a drummer, and this
I was going to ask.
his whole life. It's not me. We might hear him downstairs at some point. Yeah. So he had a great career in Austin, and he did come to Athens and enjoyed it, but Austin was, where he was doing his work. So, but it was fun because he was playing with Mary Kuchar at the time, and she opened for Greg Allman and did a whole Southeast tour my second year of grad school. So I could see him in different parts of Georgia, South Carolina. So that was fun. But anyway, we went to Athens, and it was a great experience. And I really, in my graduate program means a lot to me, and that experience meant a lot to me. But the fact that Rob went back to Austin meant that I had a real incentive to get my thesis defended and all my classwork done in 2 years and get back, which is what I did.
And it was during that experience that you maybe got your first exposure to the world of philanthropy.
I did.
And was that something that had been on your radar as a possible path prior?
Not at all. No, okay. Not in the least bit. Nope.
So tell me about that first exposure. What struck you, and did kind of the light bulb go off right away, or was it a, more gradual kind of realization?
It's a good question. I applied for and received something called the Helena Rosenthal Fellowship in New York City with Friends of the Upper East Side Historic District. So the summer between my first and second year of graduate school, I lived in New York on Crosby Street down in Soho, and I worked on 69th Street at Madison and for the Friends in this fellowship role. And it was wonderful. And I loved it. And I worked for Jane Cowan, who is the executive director of the nonprofit. I got to work with the board, had a really cool project I did creating this kind of tourist map of the historic districts of the Upper East Side. I got to go to Landmark Commission hearings with her. I got to do things around annual fund and membership and events. It was great. And by the way, I had no money. I was a very broke graduate student, but it was actually, it worked. It's hard to believe, but it worked. I spent a lot of time walking in New York, which was great fun. And I think I just loved working for Friends. And I also had taken a class where we'd done some grant writing. It was taught by someone from the Georgia Trust. And then I did grant writing when I was at Friends as well. And I really liked that. And I remember the person who taught the class at UGA asking everybody, what did you think? Would you consider the nonprofit sector? And I think I was the only person that raised my hand, or one of a few. Most people wanted to go to work for state, local government, which makes sense. And when I was, looking to come back to Austin, it was the spring break of my second year of graduate school. I had some interviews lined up, and some were with the Texas Historical Commission, where I would have worked for the state of Texas. And then I interviewed to be the director of what's now called Preservation Austin, but then was called the Heritage Society of Austin. It's one of the oldest nonprofits in Austin. And I was offered 2 jobs. One was the executive director of Preservation Austin, and the other was the Certified Local Government Coordinator Director program, or director position for the THC. And it's just weird. I mean, they had the same salary offer, similar benefits package. And I thought, I want to work for the nonprofit. And I think, again, my dad thought, yeah, but if you work for the state, that's so much more sure. It's just more of a sure thing. You'll be part of the state government, et cetera, et cetera. And this one seems riskier, but that's what I did. And we moved back. My dad and Rob came out. We were engaged at that point, Rob and I just remember packing up the U-Haul and driving it back to Austin. And I literally started work as executive director of this nonprofit a couple days later, believe it or not. And that's when oh, sorry, Brent. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and I immediately realized, I'm going to need to do fundraising. This is a big part of the job.
You went from relatively narrow scope in the past work that you had done to exec director, which means now you're head of marketing, head of fundraising, head of everything.
Yeah.
Was that overwhelming? Did you feel, was it just kind of smooth sailing? I mean, what was the, scale of the operation as well?
Yeah, at that time we had 3 staff, so it was pretty small. We had a
Yeah,
large
got it.
board though. The board
Okay.
had about, at that time, 40, 50 people. I mean, it was a big board
Wow.
for a small nonprofit. But it had been around since the 50s. I mean, really, it had a real anchor in the Austin community. And yes, it was overwhelming, definitely, because some things I understood from my experience working in private sector, because I had supervised people by the time I was leaving Career Resources. I had staff that reported to me. And so I had certain experience with, financials and budgets and, managing HR and personnel issues. But managing a board and working for a board as an executive director was new for me. And the fundraising part of it. So I immediately joined the Association of Fundraising Professionals Greater Austin chapter. And I just started talking to everybody I could in the development world in Austin. And being the state capital, there are a lot of nonprofits in Austin. There's a lot of fundraising happening, although it's still a relatively young philanthropic community compared to Houston and Dallas. So I joined AF. Yeah. Yes. No,
if you could go back in time to the Julie who was desperately seeking counsel and mentorship and guidance from AFP peers,
yeah,
and just, drop some knowledge on that person, what are kind of, when you think about what you didn't know at all then or appreciate then, what would you tell that person to have made you even more successful in that role?
Oh, that's a great question. I think if I could go back, I would want that Julie then to think more about individual philanthropy and not be so focused on event generated proceeds, which are expensive to raise. Events take a lot of human power and overhead and have costs associated with them. I would counsel that, Julie, that because you have such an established donor base and you've been around a long time, talking with individuals about opportunities to leave legacy gifts for such an organization would have been really natural. And it's not something we were actively doing. I think we were very, like many organizations at those types, we were very event focused on our gala, the awards gala, and on our homes tour event. Later in my career, I got to do golf tournaments too. So I've done all that kind of fundraising, but I think knowing what I know now, I would say, look at who your longtime supporters are. These are people you could be asking for much larger gifts than just their annual membership or their annual gift or their underwriting of a table at the gala, right? And
so there's an element of like,
yeah.
If the gala sponsorship price points are roughly what they were last year, then you work towards achieving the gala sponsorship tables versus really maybe challenging those donors to think bigger or to think about, what impact they could have that goes beyond the $1,000 table at the gala or whatever it was.
Right. That's right.
Interesting.
That's right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so I guess, in those early, I mean, when you think about your early, you had to have some one-on-one donor interactions or, individual fundraising early in your career. Are there any moments that stand out where, whether it went really poorly or really well, where you just got excited about the fundraising piece of this work?
Well, one that comes to mind for me was later in my nonprofit career when I was at Safe Place, which is a family violence shelter rape crisis center. Really amazing nonprofit in Austin. It was created from the merger of 2 other nonprofits into Safe Place. So it's both what used to be the Rape Crisis Center as well as the Center for Battered Women became Safe Place. And that was the nonprofit where we really started honing in on individual major gift philanthropy. And I can remember with the executive director, the first individual donor couple $100,000 gift just to support the nonprofit wasn't tied to an event, wasn't tied to a grant proposal, it was an ask. And they said yes. And she started crying. She was so overwhelmed. And this is someone who's someone I admire tremendously and has dedicated her life to this work. And I realized, and they and the donors were so excited, and they were overwhelmed. And both parties, in a way, had this sort of benefit and emotion. And I've often heard fundraising leaders say, when you do it well, the donors are more excited than the recipient, right? And it's, you give with your head and your heart. And so that moment was just, I just can see it, like sitting there in one of the counseling rooms and talking with this donor couple. And they just said, yes, of course we'll do this. And it was amazing. So
and going into that meeting, did you feel 50-50? Did you feel 80-20? I mean, how confident were you going into that meeting?
I think we probably felt, I think maybe we felt more 80-20, but 80, they would say no, because we were sort of worried and apologetic and, oh my gosh, is this too much? And should we ask them? And should we really be so specific with a dollar amount, and this is a big amount of money for somebody to write a check for. And I think we probably thought it was much more of a long shot.
Wow.
And even though they'd been through the shelter, they'd been through our assisted living centers, and they'd visited and learned about the programs, and they'd gotten to know us as an institution. I think this, we just didn't have the muscle development of asking for large 6-figure and later 7-figure gifts from individuals in the same way. And now I will say, to the organization's credit, it had built a building, more than a building, multiple buildings, a facility, and a lot of individual donors supported that bricks and mortar project. But this was not about bricks and mortar. This was just to support the programs.
And I would imagine, as you've advanced through your career and where you sit today, 80-20, feeling 80-20 that the ask is not going to be accepted is not where you want to be spending your time. But, are there, I don't know, after maybe seeing that 80-20 break in your favor and maybe other 80-20s that have broken in your favor, is there an element of just getting comfortable, even making the solicitation from a perceived position of weakness? Like, how do you think, because you don't want to be surprising donors constantly with wild asks that are, unlikely to connect or be fundable. But at the same time, if you don't, take a big swing once in a while, you're not going to connect as you might have in that situation. So I don't know, do you still, what do you want the odds to be before you make that solicitation?
Yeah, well, I will say now, and this is many, many years later, one thing I would say that I have felt very strongly about is I would never surprise a donor with an ask, right? I like the concept of asking permission to ask, right? And that has actually worked very well for me, both at Texas and here at Berkeley, and not just gifts I've worked on, but gifts others have worked on, and especially in the principal gift arena, we would just never surprise somebody with an ask. So and I will say, back to my safe place example, that wasn't a surprise at that meeting either. They knew we were asking them for support. So, but I feel, so sometimes people say funny things about fundraising to me. They say, oh, well, you're picking pockets or something. And I say, never, I've never done that. I would never do that. I am a big believer in the idea of asking permission to then ask. And so now in terms of odds, I think you're right. I think part of it for our institution, Safe Place at the time, was we just weren't in the habit of asking individuals for large gifts to support the programs. We were really good at writing grants and fulfilling parameters of outputs and outcomes for foundation support and grant support. We were really good at putting on events. You flip to the university world, we don't really do golf tournaments necessarily, and galas and silent auctions. And homes tours, we ask individuals to invest in our organizations in ways that are meaningful to them, right? And I think that in terms of the odds now in our work, you're absolutely right. With the tools we have, like EverTrue and other tools, we're much better prepared and have a better sense of who at least our major gift donors are and our principal gift donors and what they care about, what their passions are, how they're thinking about philanthropy, what's important to their family, et cetera, et cetera. So when we're asking, we are so much better prepared. And I think our odds are typically so much greater, right?
Yeah.
But we have more tools at our disposal.
Well, tell me about the transition from Safe Place, where it was local, very specific mission,
Yes.
Local nonprofit that was trying to build a culture of philanthropy, to then, finally pivoting into the higher education realm, where you spent over 7 years now at one of the biggest brands in higher education, certainly one of the biggest brands in Texas, with a very broad scope of work that goes beyond these very targeted nonprofits you've been working with. Obviously, it was a good experience. You spent over 7 years there, which is a long time in development world and for any job, but it also had to just be a massive shift just in the scope of work and the breadth of philanthropic possibilities at a place like UT Austin relative to some of those nonprofits.
Yes, it was. It was, in fact, I was very hesitant to leave the nonprofit world. And I have friends in the School of Architecture at UT Austin because of my time at Preservation Austin, people who served on board. There was a close connection to the School of Architecture and the preservation program. I also served on the Historic Landmark Commission in Austin, and I had friends who were on the faculty at the School of Architecture. And then the dean at the time, Fritz Steiner, who came from Arizona State, I'd actually met him when I was a graduate student, and he came out to Georgia to do something with one of the faculty members out there. And then he came to Texas to be dean of the School of Architecture. And I just wasn't even interested. I had, only been at Safe Place less than 2 years, and I built out my team, and I loved the mission, and I loved being challenged by working in a new sector in social services. And I just was not in any way looking to leave. But one of the faculty members who's a friend said, Julie, Fritz needs an assistant dean for development, and you do fundraising. This is your academic field for your master's program. You were on the Landmark Commission. You ran the preservation nonprofit. You know this world. They need you. You need to do this. And it was really funny to go through that interview process, because I think, and I give so much credit to Fritz for my career. He's at Penn now, my career, which is his graduate school alma mater. He's dean there at the Weitzman School, but he really is the one who convinced me to come to higher ed. And I don't think, if it hadn't been Fritz, I'm not sure I would have done it, to be honest with you. But yeah, I got there, I got to Texas, and I had heard in the nonprofit stories just some real horror stories about working at Texas and the competitiveness and the territoriality, and some of those things certainly are true. They're true at any large institution. But I loved being in the School of Architecture. It's a very small, prestigious part of the university, very highly ranked in design intelligence rankings. Love the faculty, love the grads, love the donors. It was so interesting. I think Fritz and I worked really well together. I had a lot of fun. It was a lot of work, but it was a huge change, because first of all, I was used to working for governing boards directly, right? Who run the organization and make the key decisions and have the oversight. And that's not the case with the university advisory boards, right? A place like Texas, a place like Berkeley, we're actually governed by a board of regents who are very far removed from the day-to-day operations, typically of the institution. So I just kept saying, well, we have all these volunteers, but what do they actually get to do and decide on? It's so different from the nonprofit sector. And then I would say also the focus on endowment fundraising was really new for me, right? Because I came from the sector where either as an executive director or director of development, you're having to make sure you can make payroll, pay your bills, keep the doors open, fulfill your programs. And it's very hands-on. And you said you're many things, you wear many hats. I used to joke, you're in charge of the budget, you're in charge of the fundraising, you're in charge of the dishwashing, you have it all. And that was really different to come to a university. And it's not like you're trying to raise the money to keep the school open per se, in the same way you are in the nonprofit sector. The focus is different. So the endowment fundraising, and then the focus on gift planning. And I've learned so much and had so much experience in both my higher ed jobs working in gift planning. And I'm not sure I would have had that the same way in the nonprofit sector, although it depends on the nonprofit. And but that has been something I have enjoyed tremendously.
I want to come back to gift planning in a second, but my guess would be, after your dad being skeptical but supportive on many of these decisions, he was probably pretty excited about the UT Austin move, or no?
He was. Yeah, he was happy with that.
Very cool. And so let's just talk about gift planning for a second, because I actually just recently hosted a gentleman who runs gift planning at the UConn Foundation, Greg Knott, and Greg had sent me an email and said, "Hey, you never talk about gift planning on the show. You should." And I said, "Will you come onto the show and tell me about it?" And I realized I don't talk about it because I don't know very much about it. So what else should we know? Like, you already hinted at it, as if you could go back in time and talk to, younger you earlier in your career, you'd have a focus on individual fundraising and legacy and gift planning. So when along your journey did that start to click? Because I think it can just be one of those areas, silos, you hear about it, but you don't really focus on it or learn about it until you experience it. And so when did you start to really appreciate it, and why?
I definitely think I started to appreciate it at the School of Architecture. And we also, while I was there as assistant dean, we turned 100. And something cool about the School of Architecture at UT in the first class, I think it was, if I'm remembering this correctly, 50-50 women and men. For me, that really clicked in the School of Architecture, and it's a beautiful part of the Texas campus. The buildings are phenomenal. Cass Gilbert and Goldsmith designed some of them, and Goldsmith Hall is amazing. It's one of the best architecture school physical locations in anywhere. And I think that we really had a lot of engagement with people around legacy giving, because you think about it, if you're in a 5-year BArch program, Bachelor of Architecture program, you're in studio and you're in Goldsmith Hall like 24/7, and you're in a graduate career, you feel a lot of connection to the place and to the faculty and to the school. And we had really good, I will say that we had excellent participation rates among our BArch alumni in terms of just giving annually. And I think we also had really strong legacy giving. And those things to me go hand in hand a little bit, Brent, because I think what I've learned from the people who are expert at this is the strong indicator of making a legacy gift to an institution is consistent annual giving, right? And especially somebody who's been giving consistently for a long period of time and then been incrementally stepping up the giving, that's a very good sign of somebody who will want to, or maybe already has included you in their legacy plans. Yeah.
I'd love to know a bit about your transition to UC Berkeley. When I think about your move from Dallas to Boston and the, change, culture shock, different contexts, but also, exciting, amazing experiences. I'm sure there was a version of that making your way to Northern California after a 7-year run at UT Austin. And what I want to know about that transition, but also as you sit where you sit now, you're just operating at a scale that few do. And so when you say things like, it is important to have that strong base of consistent, loyal annual support, because that leads to planned gift and principal giving. And that's what all the data suggests. But at the same time, you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of constituents. And if you're talking about truly moving the needle from a philanthropic perspective, I have no doubt that that is largely going to be governed by a handful of people or a couple hundred people at the very, very top of the giving pyramid. And so, and you know, even in collaboration with your team, we realize with your team, I'm sure it's no different at UT Austin, that the amount of wealth, the amount of high capacity, unmanaged prospects who are annual supporters, it's an enormous figure. And if you could snap your fingers and hire hundreds of gift officers, you still might not be able to cover every relationship that you'd like to cover. And so how do you think about balancing resource allocation, either at UT Austin or at UC Berkeley, recognizing that no matter how well resourced you are, there's going to be a limit in how many relationships you can really build?
That's
like,
right.
it's almost the opposite of probably how you felt at Safe Place, where it wasn't like, we have so many incredible existing supporters who we could potentially migrate up the giving pyramid. But that is something that I think is somewhat unique to institutions like UT Austin and UC Berkeley.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I think this is where a good understanding of the analytics work and the data, the kinds of things you guys do, it's institutions like Berkeley and Texas have to have that as a overlay on making decisions about where to resource. And I'll give you a good example from our regional major gifts team. We are focused in this campaign, which is a $6 billion campaign. And these are huge numbers the universities put out, right? And sometimes overwhelmingly large, but we're 4.3 billion of the way there, which is fantastic. But I get asked all the time, well, what's the strategy on the regional team? And based on the data analysis we did with Martz and Lundy, we could see that we could do a $6 billion campaign based on our support on the East Coast, primarily New York, Connecticut, Boston, Northern California, Southern California, and Asia. And that is where we have put resources. And I get asked all the time, Brent, well, Julie, you're from Texas. Why aren't you building out teams in Texas or going to Florida or Chicago or Seattle? Well, we can't go everywhere. And I'm not a big fan myself of kind of the one and done, where you show up in a region with your chancellor and deans and faculty, and you come in once and you have a big event and you don't have anyone consistently there. You don't have a consistent alumni presence there. You don't have a consistent engagement. I've seen that done, and I just don't think that works very well. So I have been real focused that these are the 4 areas for the regional major gifts team in this campaign where we're focused, because we have built out staff there. We've built out alumni engagement work there. We are, some areas are better cultivated than others, but, and the data shows us this is where we can have a good return on investment. And you do have to make some choices, right? Because you're right. It doesn't matter how much budget you have. You would never be able at these large institutions to cover everything and get to everyone.
Can I just ask how your perspective might have changed over the last year, and going through this idea that, there's this once in a lifetime technology adoption? I'm sure you've had donor conversations via Zoom that you never would have imagined you would do via Zoom. I bet you've been able to involve faculty or deans or other stakeholders in ways that wouldn't have lined up for traditional field travel. Yet here we sit on the cusp of being able to travel again. But it does make me wonder that if we're not as rooted, if we're all if we're a Zoom link away from Southern India, if we're a Zoom link away from London, if we're a Zoom link away from, every constituent, does the campaign of the future need to be as geographically oriented as you are right now? And there's a balance, because you need to be focused. You're 4.3 out of 6 there. But I am just curious, as you think about how much more reachable donors are, everybody being a Zoom link away, have you had experiences in the last year that maybe make you believe there could be more of a hybrid future?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I have to say, I'm thinking about some of the new donors we've engaged during this COVID period, and it's interesting. There's a couple in Asia. There are trying to think if there's anybody at the major gift or principal gift level who's sort of outside of our, California, West Coast, New York, Asia region. There isn't anyone coming to mind, but we are having these conversations about what's the technology going to mean, because we actually have a new director of the regional teams who was the director of Southern California, and she's giving a lot of thought to, might we reallocate some of our resources? But I will say this, I think that it's one thing to, have a gift officer who could maybe cover some additional regions as a fundraiser, but what are you doing around continued strategies around engagement, activities, and outreach and building community? Are you going to do all that on Zoom? I mean, at some point, I'm not entirely sure that people aren't going to be wanting something that isn't on Zoom. But to your point, I will say we have chancellors' councils in New York, Southern California, and Asia, and the attendance at those meetings with the chancellor, especially in Asia, because they come from many different countries, has been phenomenal, because we can do it on Zoom, and it's much easier for the constituents. But whether or not that means that you could have success in raising major gifts and principal gifts in new regions long term, doing it all using technology versus having to be there in person and building out a larger program, I don't know. That to me is a TBD. Maybe. I mean, I do not think when we come back after COVID, things will go back to exactly the way they were. Yeah. I completely agree with that. And
we're not going to unlearn these skills and these technologies next year, right? I mean, we may not want to use them as much as we have last year, but we're not going to unlearn it. And so I think that it is what is a more efficient hybrid approach where, maybe every fourth advisory board meeting is now in person instead of Zoom. And so that it's more cost effective. There's still a balance of, in-person personalization and experiences for sure. It will be a little bit, TBD, but I think that we're very optimistic. I'm actually now just thinking, I just had a conversation with a friend who actually a coworker's fiance who works as a buyer for Carter's. And so she's, probably a 2021 version of what you were doing in India in 1993. And what have they had to do? It used to be that if you wanted to, select merchandise to purchase, well, you had to go and touch and feel it. And now they've had to do all of those things over Zoom. And I think about, what that equivalent role that you did in 1993 and all those trips to India, maybe there's a tenth of the trips required or a fourth of the trips required. And applying that to this world, how many constituents are in India that now are a Zoom link away? And maybe there are ways that we can go deeper in the giving pyramid with our constrained resources in more of a hybrid approach. And so, something we're excited to continue to explore.
Yeah, I can see that point, definitely. And I particularly think it'll be interesting to see, I don't know the answer to this, but how generationally different that will be. I know on some of your podcasts, you've talked about the millennials and Gen Z and how they think about this versus, say, Gen X or the boomers. And although we've had all generations show up for our Zoom homecoming, we did a homecoming and parents weekend completely remote. I think we had 46 countries represented, right? We would never get that in person.
Never,
right?
Never. Yeah. And so it doesn't mean we don't want real homecoming, because we do. It's going to be amazing next year. Think about how great that is going to be. But we also want 46 countries to feel included and a part of the community. And so, that's where I think there's going to be this whole new category of digital event experiences that can allow us great scale, hopefully going beyond all the Zoom boxes in exactly the same way at every single event. But that we can balance real homecoming with something more scalable. I have to ask, just as you think about the last year, what are you excited about that you've worked on? I mean, are there specific gifts you've been a part of, or just highlights that you would want to cite or share for our community? I know you just had a great big give as part of your community. I caught up with your colleague Howard and others about that recently, but what are some of the things that really make you proud over the last year?
Well, one thing that I'm incredibly proud of, and Howard is a part of this, as well as our external relations and marketing communications team, and frankly, the whole community, was we launched the campaign February 29th of 2020. We were basically the last big in-person event on the campus.
Wow.
And then, 2 weeks later, we were moving into shelter in place. And starting in about April, we heavily pivoted to fundraising for COVID-19 related needs, immediate needs. Student emergency funding was a big one, as it was for most universities, and COVID-19 related research that was taking place on the campus, and the need to be able to stand up some things like, face masks for everybody who's an essential employee, and more hand sanitizing stations and things like that. And we very quickly pivoted as an advancement community on this particular need, and raised about 36 million so far, all in outright support. It's none of it's endowed. It's maybe a couple of pledges, but it's all outright. And about 2/3 of it is geared around the research needs and, kind of helping the campus get through this and all the things we needed to get through it. And then about 1/3 has been on the student emergency fund side for graduate students and undergraduates. But what's been exciting is to see the number of first-time donors and lapsed donors who have given. I hope I quote this correctly, or that I remember this correctly. I think it's been about 6,000 unique donors that have stepped up. And I'm really excited to see and think about, how do we convert those lapsed donors and first-time donors into becoming lifelong donors to Berkeley?
Absolutely.
And will we see that this COVID-19 channel for either starting back up your giving or making your first gift is a channel that makes you more likely to continue with your giving to the campus, right? That's what we don't know yet, but I'm excited to see, because one thing we've learned with Big Give, and we just had the 7th Big Give, as you said, and Howard really wanted to hit 16,000 gifts. And I heard yesterday we looks like we just went over 16,000, which is a record. And congratulations to him and all the people who work on Big Give, because as you know, it takes a village to do these things. But we, now that we're in 7 years in, we can see that Big Give as a channel for a first gift increases your likelihood of making your second gift, and more so than traditional channels, other channels. And so I'm very intrigued and interested to see what we find with people who've come in through the COVID-19 portal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also, this is an area where we're spending a lot of time. What can we do to shorten the cycle between either that first time gift or the reactivation gift? And, for the segment of the population that maybe is very, let's call it high net worth, but giving at a pretty modest level, how can we use data and analytics to surface those prospects in a more automated way to create elevated stewardship experiences, so that it doesn't mean that, it has to be 25 years from now when that major gift occurs, or it has to be, decades before the planned gift comes in. And I think that that's an area where there's going to be a lot of innovation in the coming years for sure. One other topic I wanted to get your perspective on, and I know we need to wrap up soon, but we did ask you in a pre-podcast questionnaire where you thought the sector was investing and under-investing. And you didn't comment on the over-investing, but on the under-investing, you did say under-investing in diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice work, and that you see that rapidly and you just hope it sticks. Tell me more about why you answered that way, why you see that changing rapidly, and why you're maybe somewhat concerned that it might not stick.
Wow. Yeah, those are really good questions. I think why it's more than just the history of advancement, right? It's the history of our country and all that goes into that, and the history of higher education in our institutions, and the complex history that we have. So it's, I think that advancement traditionally, and in fact, this just happened to me not too long ago with an institution, has thought of the philanthropist as the men, and specifically white men. And that's been sort of how advancement and fundraising has focused in the past, its efforts, thinking these were the decision makers, this is what a philanthropist looks like. And we know darn well that that's not the case. And it's a very diverse landscape of people who are philanthropic. But I think there's been a history in our field of looking at the philanthropist looks like this. And what I was saying in my little side comment was, we just got a thank you letter. I won't name the institution, that was written only to my husband. And I just nearly fell out of my chair, because one thing I certainly learned working at Safe Place was, do not make the assumption that the husband or the male part of the donor party is the one making the decisions, right? And in our case, definitely our family philanthropy is driven by me. And so I actually sent a nice note to the institution just to say, I want to, just as colleagues and a supporter, I just want to point this out, because it is what I do for a living too. And I do care about your institution. So that why is it's as complicated as the landscape of American history, right? And the history of our nation. And I think the last case conference I attended, which was the All Districts Conference, I had a chance to hear a keynote speaker from BU actually talk about how admissions offices are so much further ahead than advancement offices on this DEIB work, right? And looking at—
You mean in the engagement of the constituency they're serving, or within the office itself?
I think this was about both, to be honest with you,
Okay.
Because it takes one to support the other at some level. And that in advancement, that we could learn a lot from the admissions offices in our institutions. And I thought about our Berkeley admissions office, and I think that's very true. And I took that point, and that we could move more quickly, Brent, too.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think that there are institutions, though, that I think have been focused on this and have been investing in this. And I'm going to put on a little plug here for CASE, and I am on the board at CASE. And so just want to disclose that. But I feel like CASE has been focused on this for a number of years, and certainly under the work that Rob Henry's done at CASE, Sue Cunningham's leadership as CEO. I think this is a place where CASE is bringing a lot of good work to the table. I've had conversations with colleagues at some of the big consulting firms. They acknowledge, the advancement consulting firms, they acknowledge that they've got catching up to do for certain. And this hasn't been an area of strength for them. So
I will say, while it hasn't been an area of strength, I just believe it's a little bit, look, let's take your personal example. Why did you end up at BU? Well, it sounds like in part, somebody at BU admissions developed a strategy to more aggressively recruit students from Texas. And that is one factor that led you there. And I'm sure we've all been a part of different, different priorities and goal setting. And I think as a company right now, we're having the same conversations. What can we do? Not just resting on the fact that we feel like if we do a good job in our work, that can help create relationship building, and that can lead to philanthropy, which can lead to access and opportunity and justice and belonging. That's good, but how can we make it more direct? And I do believe that one of the huge opportunities in the advancement world is you are on a campus of talented young people that are much more reflective of the composition of your state or our country than most advancement shops or most tech companies like Evertrue. And so we're just sitting here saying, what can we do to be as focused and committed and aggressive as the BU admissions team was about their Texas strategy in the late 80s, right? And so I think that that's where we are uniquely positioned in the sector to activate these latent talent pools that just aren't reflected in our org charts as well as I think they need to be.
And I think the data we have about the Grow Your Own model from places that have had internship programs like Michigan and Penn State is that it is a way to, address this. Although I will say there are some people who say this notion that we don't have enough of a diverse pipeline to recruit from is false. You have to think differently about how you recruit and what you look for. And I think there's some truth to that. But I agree with you about a grow your own model. It's something I really wanted to do at Texas, and we just didn't have the resources at the time to do it. And it's something I'd very much like to do here at Berkeley. And I think that is a place where we could have tremendous impact. And I think it ties back to this point about looking at our admissions offices and what they've done and how they've been able to accomplish this and taking a cue from their playbook. But we do have to resource it, and you have to stick with it, Brent. I mean, it can't be a sort of one and done thing. This has to be a true commitment that's longstanding and invested in and resourced by the institution. And that's what I'm really committed to doing, at least with the part of advancement that I have some control over, I guess you could say. And we've brought in a really excellent DEIB consultant, Monroe France from NYU, who's working with the UDAR team at Berkeley. And, it's not easy work. He's told us that from the get-go, and we've just done a whole round of listening sessions with our staff that he facilitated, and then we just did a survey with Talmetrics. And as a leader, sometimes it's kind of hard to hear what people have to say, but that's what we're here to do. And I'm feeling really optimistic though about this moment, I have to say. And but it still doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean we have all the answers either. But as I think about the end of the campaign that we're in at Berkeley, it'll end at the end of 2023. And I think about the work we did at the beginning around our kind of one Berkeley culture and developing more of a hybrid model for the advancement work at Berkeley. We'd been very, very decentralized before. I think about this sort of end of the campaign coming in to do some significant work in DEIBJ that will be lasting, that will change things and not just sort of check a box, right? Because that's not going to be effective.
Well, it's a little bit like the impact of having consistent loyal donors today will really be felt 10 or 20 or 30 years from now.
That's
so
right.
There's an element of like, how do we make sure that big change leadership level that we can make today, we do, but also at the same time, make sure we're planting seeds that that will continue to grow over the coming decades. Final kind of question. I mean, you've referenced so many like mentors and people who've shaped you, and that is a recurring theme among many of the leaders that we've hosted on this podcast. And I love hearing about it because mentorship has played a huge role in my life. But who are some of those mentors that, if you haven't already mentioned, who are they and how they helped you, and what advice would you have to others who are maybe seeking mentors?
Well, specific to advancement leaders, I certainly have to point to my colleague at UCLA and the UC system, Rhea Turteltaub. She's mentored many people I know, and I got to know her through the Big Ten Fundraising Institute. I was able to attend BitFry when I was at Texas, and that's an amazing opportunity for people. And Rod Kirsch also was there and was a part of that. I was there the year that so many things had happened at Penn State that were just so hard. And to hear from him about what they were going through and how they were addressing it was really inspirational. But yeah, Rhea is somebody I have looked to for a long time and still do. And I think she, you think about the size and complexity of UCLA and everything Rhea's got to do. She makes herself available to people, and it's really, you appreciate that, because in these jobs, there aren't a lot of people you can call for advice who've been there. For me, I'd say another person who I think of as a mentor is John Ford, who was at Stanford, Martin Lundy. Then he was my counterpart at UCSF when I moved into the Vice Chancellor role. And I appreciate John so much because he had the kind of Stanford vice president experience, and then he had the UCSF vice chancellor experience. I've only been at 2 large public institutions, so I can't say that I know the private university world quite as well. And he's seen both. So he has been, continued to be, even in his retirement, somebody whose counsel and advice I really appreciate. And frankly, I think I there's the 3 Johns, because there's John Ford, and then there's John Cash at Mertz and Lundy, who is our campaign counsel and has been wonderful, and is a Berkeley grad and worked at Berkeley in advancement a long time ago, but he knows the place so well, and he's been such a good partner to me in all that we've been trying to do these last 7 years. And then the other John is John Gleer, of course, at GGNA. And Berkeley is part of the Advancement Leadership Forum public group. And I've gotten to know John over the years. And so I just joke about the 3 Johns in advancement consulting that we all rely on and have done so much in this world. And the last person I'd mention is Connie Kravis, who was the vice president at University of Washington. I think she's retired now, and she really did an amazing job up there. And I sometimes wonder if, University of Washington is where it is geographically, people don't always remember what a just outstanding advancement shop they have there. And they've done a lot of big things, like really bringing together the alumni relations portfolio, the communications portfolio, the development portfolio in a very cohesive and integrated fashion, while working in a really decentralized environment with strong deans and strong independents. And they had an amazing campaign, and they do such a good job, I think. Yeah. And Connie also has always been so willing to share her time and her expertise and her advice. And I think the other thing is she's such a nice and kind person with so low ego, and yet she's accomplished so much in this field. I just think the world of her.
I love it. It's great hearing those examples. And I think it does highlight, again, just how collaborative this sector can be. The fact that we're not competitors is cited quite frequently, but it just does allow for a level of sharing that you rarely find in other sectors. And I think on that note, Julie, thank you so much for sharing your journey across the country, across the world. It's just amazing to learn more about you. And again, just the scale that you're operating at is so rare. I guess my last question would be, when you think about the best advancement professionals you've worked with, and you can define best however you want, but are there common characteristics or traits that come to mind when you're either interviewing people or when you just reflect on some of even those people you just named as mentors?
Yes, certainly. I think first and foremost, you really have to care deeply about mission and the mission of the institution, and being part of a mission-driven cause. And you can tell that with somebody pretty darn quickly. And so the people I think of who do so well in this work, they so genuinely are motivated by helping others, and helping others both fulfill their philanthropic dreams with what they want to accomplish, and using the philanthropy to help others do important and great work in our world. So I think that is definitely something that is true of all the people I know who've been so successful in advancement. I would also say just sort of the advancement leaders that I think have so highly, they are very humble, and they really want to see others succeed, and really recognize that you can't do this work at a high level without a lot of people at the table. And it takes the back office functions, and it takes the fundraisers and everything else. And you have to recognize that and support that, and want to see others succeed, right? And I think the leaders that I really admire, when they talk about some of their staff and things that they've done, you can just see the pride and the support and the way that they elevate others, right? I admire that a lot. And I also think to be in higher ed, you just have to truly be jazzed about working with the faculty and the students. And I know when I'm having kind of a challenging day, if I go to an event with the students or I, have a meeting with an inspiring faculty member, it really just picks me up and lifts me up like nothing else. And obviously I have a thing for living in college towns, Berkeley, Austin, Boston, Athens. So I like them clearly. But I like the people, and I like getting to see big things happen, important things happen, the challenges of the world addressed by faculty and students alike. I find that exciting. So the people who I think do this work really well, clearly they also care deeply about what higher education has done for them and can do for others. And that comes through very clearly.
I love it. Well said. And your passion and affinity for both the separate and college towns. And we tried to make most of Zoom over the last year. I'm excited myself to hit the road again and we together. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Julie. Be well and best wishes as you continue to accelerate through the end of the campaign.
Thank you, Brent. It's good to visit with you. I really appreciate being invited. Take care.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.